In this video, we're covering some key themes from chapters 15 and 16, organizational structure and culture. So structure and culture are two of the three elements of organizational design. Structure is the way work is orchestrated and resources are distributed. Essentially, who does what in an organization and who gets what. Culture are the shared values and norms, the kind of intangible things that bind people who work at the same organization together. Control, which is an aspect we don't have a chapter directly covering, but is covered a bit in the motivation chapter, is about internal governance and rewards, the carrots and sticks that encourage people to do their work. So let's dive right into structure. There are 6 key elements that define an organizational structure. Specialization, how specific or general your job function is. At a startup, perhaps you do 10 different things. You might do all the marketing and also work as the admin and the tech person, whereas oftentimes at a large organization you can have a very specialized job. Departmentalization, how are jobs grouped together? Typically they're grouped functionally, so there's, for example, a sales and marketing department, but sometimes they're grouped by product teams. Formalization, are expectations and rules codified? Some rules you might get an employee manual that tells you precisely what is expected of you. That's a very formalized job. Centralization, do decisions come from the top, or do you have a lot of autonomy to make your own decisions lower on in the organization? Chain of command, who reports to who? And finally, span of control, how many subordinates do you have? To illustrate the concept of span of control, if you have a wide span of control, so say every manager has roughly 8 people reporting to them, you end up having fewer middle managers. You can kind of see that in the orange pyramid on the right. A smaller span of control, you end up having more layers of management. There are trade-offs for both. A larger span of control is more cost-effective because you cut out a bunch of middle managers, but sometimes that larger span of control means you have less touch time and are a less effective leader for your team. So these 6 elements kind of come together on a spectrum. You see some go together better than others. And we kind of generally describe 2 different types of organizations, an organic organization and a mechanistic organization. An organic organization features low specialization. It's a very informal, decentralized, non-hierarchical kind of environment. Think of what you'd imagine a tech startup to be like. On the other side, a mechanistic organization tends to have highly specialized jobs, is very formal. Decision-making is all done centrally, and there's a very clear hierarchy. I use McDonald's as the epitome of a mechanistic organization. But most organizations fall somewhere in between those 2 extremes on this spectrum and can have different degrees of these different traits of specialization, formalization, centralization, etc. Now we'll look quickly at 3 different types of common organizational structures. So first there's the simple structure, where there's little or no division of labor, and this is what's often used for very small firms that don't have very many employees, such as law or professional service offices, maybe a dentist's office, startups, or small retailers. Then there's the bureaucracy. Bureaucracies have division of labor. Oftentimes, specialization occurs, and sometimes the departmentalization is based on function. This is an example here where it's based on function. So you see on this org chart there's an R&D department, a manufacturing department, marketing and sales, etc. It's not clear that this structure is mechanistic or organic, just inherently based on the structure itself. It's certainly more mechanistic than the startup with absolutely no structure on the page, but like I said, it's not clear just from this org chart whether it's mechanistic or organic. You can also have a bureaucracy that's divided up based on products as opposed to functions or geographies. Here's an example of a product-based division. You see SBU stands for Strategic Business Unit there, so each strategic business unit might represent a product or group of products. Then you have the matrixed organization. Unlike a bureaucracy where there's a clear chain of command, you know directly who you directly report to, in a matrix you will have two managers. Oftentimes it's by geography and product or by function and product, but essentially you have two people you're reporting to, which can obscure the chain of command and get rid of unity of command, which can be a bit confusing for some employees, but the matrix organization structure developed in part so that people don't have these deeply ingrained loyalties just to their product team or just to their function, and that they have to consider the things that impact both the function or the product or the geography. There are both pluses and minuses to this organizational structure. So, how do businesses determine their organizational structure? What really impacts the effectiveness of organizational structure? So I've already hit on size. Size of company is a big one. If you only have a few employees, you're not going to have a very formalized bureaucracy. Strategy is another one. Organizations that are looking to minimize cost might increase spans of control to cut out those layers of middlemen. Technology is another one. So technology in this sense is just how you produce things. So it doesn't mean your IT system necessarily. So in some organizations where there's a very standardized production technology, once again, you think about McDonald's, every hamburger goes through the same process to be created. You might have a more formalized mechanistic structure than, say, a high-end retailer that makes furniture and every piece is kind of made custom to customer specifications. Finally, there's environment. So your book uses environment to describe kind of broadly what's going on in the world economy, what's going on in the industry, and how does that impact your organization. If you are an organization in an industry that is rapidly changing, you might choose a more organic structure because it allows you to adapt more readily. Mechanistic structures, because they're more formalized and they're more ingrained, or don't adapt quite as easily or as quickly. So moving on to organizational culture. Organizational culture refers to a system of shared meaning held by members that distinguishes that organization from other organizations. So this is kind of the intangible glue that holds an organization together. So just like any nation or group, firms have cultures. Cultures can be an informal mechanism for reinforcing accepted behaviors in an organization. So instead of having to spell all the rules out in a book, if people kind of generally understand what is accepted and what isn't accepted at an organization, then you can have a less formalized structure just because people understand what's expected of them already. Of course, not all organizations have a single culture. There are also subcultures that might develop. Think of it a little bit like high school, or the social scene in high school. Everyone goes to the same high school, so they probably live in the same place. They have the same sports mascot, so there's some aspects of kind of shared culture, what those different things kind of mean to the overall school. But then you might be a jock, or you might be a goth, or you might be a geek, or whatever social group you identify with, and you might have your distinct values that are a little bit different than those of the overall group, although you still have those overall group values. So strong cultures certainly have their benefits. They increase employee engagement and lessen the time you need to instruct employees on what's expected of them because they already kind of informally understand that. But on the flip side, there is a lot of value in diversity of opinion, and a very strong culture might squash some of that diversity of opinion. People who don't fit in with that strong culture might leave the organization, and that in some ways can weaken decision making in the organization. A cult is an example of an organization with an extremely strong culture, and you certainly don't want to work at a cult, or at least most of us don't. So, what defines organizational culture? Innovation and risk taking, attention to detail, outcome orientation, people orientation, team orientation, aggressiveness, and stability. So, 7 different characteristics. Organizational culture are kind of the norms and values that are manifested by these different characteristics. I recommend you read up on them a little bit in the book because we don't have time in this video to go through them in depth. So, how does an organization develop a culture? Initially, an organization's culture comes from its founders. Founders hire people that share similar values. They indoctrinate and socialize employees to their way of thinking and feeling. And they model the behaviors and values they want to see in employees. Similarly, even once a culture is established, it's transmitted through very similar means. Top leadership models values. There are oftentimes formal onboarding programs or training programs that help indoctrinate employees and share values. Specifically, you'll find that culture is transmitted through stories. Most people can tell you how the company they work for was founded. Rituals. Walmart, for example, has a chant that they do in their retail stores before every shift starts. Symbols, from the way the headquarters looks to the way executives dress or the vehicles they drive, all kind of send some messages about the culture of an organization. And the language employees use. Some of you might have worked in an organization before that uses a lot of jargon or acronyms, and this language is a way to identify other employees who share a similar culture. Outsiders would find this level of jargon sometimes impenetrable. Company. So, what is the impact of culture? A lot of the innovative companies we hear about in the news are characterized by their open or unconventional cultures. Recruiting and retaining employees is certainly easier if you have a attractive and strong culture. A strong culture can enhance organizational commitment and increase the consistency of employee behavior. And an organization ultimately can become institutionalized, even when the products and services that the organization offers are no longer relevant. If the organization has a strong culture, the organization itself can persist through lots of change. I like to give the example of Western Union, which actually started off serving customers on the Pony Express, so transmitting messages by pony. Today, they're a technology-enabled financial services business, so their products have certainly changed, but the organization and its culture persists. So why does culture matter? This chart just gives you a quick view of the returns that S&P 500 companies and Russell 3000 companies, so essentially large companies and small companies. Those are two groups of large companies, the S&P 500 and then the small companies, Russell 3000. The returns they've made on the stock market over the last 10 years or so. Then you look at the returns made by companies that were on Fortune 100's best companies to work for. And you see that there's a big difference. Culture directly relates to performance. On the flip side, culture is very difficult to change because it develops slowly, and once it's established, it changes very slowly. So having a culture that doesn't fit with the environment a business is operating in, or that reinforces negative aspects of an organization's structure or practices, can also lead to a lot of inertia.